India-Japan relations have existed for more than 1,000 years.
India and Japan are celebrating 70th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two nations.
We've never had problems between India and Japan.
But in 1998,
today at 15:45 hours, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests.
then Japanese ambassador called these tests as a slap on the face of the Japanese people.
Pakistan, China, the United States of America, and several other countries sharply reacted to the Indian nuclear tests.
Japan froze its yen loans to India. Official dialogues were cancelled. So here's one incident which made India win the Japanese hearts. So what happened once? India-Japan relations have existed for more than 1,000 years. It dates back to 6th century CE. The first common link between India and Japan was Buddhism. Buddhist philosophy was actually introduced to Japan by Korea in 539 and was made a state religion in Japan in 593 itself. A Buddhist monk from the Indian city of Madurai named Bodhisena visited Japan in 736, became a Buddhist bishop, stayed there until his death. From there on, Buddhism spread rapidly in the entire Japanese islands, having a major influence in the subsequent formation of the Japanese culture and society. But it was not just Indian-born Buddhism that has had an influence in the Japanese culture. Hinduism, infused through Buddhism, has also had an influence in the Japanese culture. Please note, Hinduism and Buddhism has only had influence in the Japanese culture. That doesn't mean it is the root of the Japanese culture. Japan had a distinct culture since very long, and then Hinduism had an influence in shaping up the culture. There are so many commonalities in Indian and Japanese cultures. The concept of village god is common in both the cultures. Prayers before eating, leaving the slippers outside before entering the temple premises. The native Japanese religion Shinto has so many similarities with Hinduism. Both Shinto and Hinduism are polytheistic. Polytheism is a worship of multiple gods. Both worship an elephant-headed deity that represents the remover of obstacles. Both worship a goddess that represents music and learning. There is a god of death, the god of destruction, the god that is a protector, the god of creation. More than 20 Hindu deities are worshipped in Japan. There are more than hundreds of Hindu shrines in Japan and are well protected. Remember that.
Very interestingly, more than 80% of Japanese gods are originally Indian god.
The Japanese, even today, have a special respect to the ancient Indian culture. A popular Japanese philosopher says, without Indian influence, Japanese culture would not be what it is today. And that Japan, even today, encourages studies on Hindu gods is a testament to the fact that they have so much respect to the Indian culture. So much that even we native Indians do not respect as much as they do.
These Koyasan temples, they have still Siddhan, Sanskrit school. Many monks are learning this Sanskrit, but the Sanskrit is Siddhan letters.
In classical Japanese, India is called as Tenjiku. It means the land of heaven. That was the level of appreciation they had for the Indian civilization. This was how India influenced Japan right throughout the ancient and medieval times. But in the modern era, that is during the 1900s, Japan influenced India a lot. Let me tell you how. In 1900s, India was fighting for its independence against British. On the other side, Japan was fighting a war against an imperial Russia. Even Japan was an imperialist. Up until that war between Russia and Japan, there was no Asian power, forget about winning, couldn't even stand a chance against the European powers. The common belief among Asian powers was that it was impossible to defeat a European power. But Japan put such a belief into ashes. It defeated Russia. Japan's victory stunned the Western powers. They were in shock at Japan's decisive victory. In Asia, there was a huge admiration for the Japanese victory. It proved to them that the European powers weren't invincible. And especially in India, which was fighting for its independence, the Japanese victory instilled a high level of nationalist spirit in the Indian freedom fighters to fight the British. It inspired a generation of revolutionaries to take up arms to fight the British. It gave them courage to pursue their goal of freeing India from the British colonization. So this started a sense of pan-Asian feeling among the Asians, who were subjected to some or the other sort of European domination. But Japan also started going the European way, like thinking itself to be a superior power compared to the Asian powers. They invaded China and Korea based on an inferiority complex. They became very aggressive. We all know their actions during the Second World War, how they ran a rampage from the east. So Indian nationalists who were inspired by Japanese nationalism weren't happy with the imperial actions. They condemned Japanese human rights violations in Manchuria. Nehru said, Japan not only followed European industrial methods, but also in imperial aggression. So you observe, Japan took up the best aspects from the Indian civilization. For example, the yoga and spiritualism, leaving out the bad aspects, the caste discrimination. And in the modern era, India took up the spirit of nationalism and modernization, ditched the imperial spirit of Japan. This was sharing of the best aspects each had and ditching the bad ones. Although imperial Japan was deemed evil, there were some in India who still thought of making use of it for a greater cause. The revolutionaries, whose ideology was, if India was to get its independence, it was only through an armed struggle. They thought if they were to defeat the British through an armed resistance, it could only be possible by an equally advanced and modern power as the British. And if it was another Asian power, it could be a bonus. So they found Japan to be that power that could help them achieve their goal of freeing India from the British colonization. So the Indian revolutionaries started developing intimate links with Japan and its people. It was a Bose, Raj Bihari Bose. He went to Japan in 1915, became a Japanese citizen in 1924, mastered the Japanese language, wrote in the Japanese press, soliciting the Japanese support for the Indian independence. Through his writings, he tilted Japanese people's opinion in favor of India's independence. When the British ordered the deportation of Raj Bihari Bose and other nationalists from Japan, there was massive public sympathy for them and massive contempt for the British government. Raj Bihari Bose was also leading an army of war prisoners of the British Indian Army captured by the Japanese soldiers during the Malayan campaign. This army of prisoners was the Indian National Army that went on to play a major role, although indirectly, in India's independence. So in 1943, Subhash Chandra Bose, after being expelled from Congress for ideological differences, was very much clear in his mind that violence was the only way to free India from the British and was hell-bent on using the World War as an opportunity to throw them out. He never minded siding with the Britain's enemies to achieve that. Bose had met Hitler and arrived in Japan. Raj Bihari Bose, who was in awe of Subhash's patriotic zeal, very willingly handed over the INA's leadership to him. Bose inspired the demoralized INA soldiers to launch an attack on the British Indian Army from Burma and free India. Bose met the Japanese PM Tojo. Tojo was pretty much impressed by his intelligence. With all the sympathies to India's cause, gave full support to use Japanese army's help in India's liberation. So with the Japanese army support, the INA launched an attack on British Indian Army from the northeast, but defeated decisively. Yet, the INA's fight and resolve gave rise to a series of revolts in the British Indian Army and gave way for Indian independence. But there was a debate as to Japan's intentions. Since its intentions were imperial, some argued that the Japanese INA victory would have handed over India from one imperialist to another, and that India freed from Britain could end up becoming a Japanese puppet state. This could be sort of true in a sense because Japan supported INA's plan because it wanted to build a sphere of influence in Asia. Unfortunately, it couldn't, as its World War II allies, Germany and Italy, surrendered to the Allied powers. Japan itself was forced to surrender with the dropping of the infamous nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
Japan was subjected to massive destruction and needed a rapid rebuilding from here. The end of World War divided the world into two blocks: the capitalist Western Bloc and the communist Eastern Bloc. The USA and its allies on one side, and the Soviet and its allies on the other side. This bipolarization of the world impacted the India-Japan relationship too. Japan, after the massive devastation by US, sided with the US. In fact, became an ally of the US because it required economic assistance to rebuild itself. India, on the other hand, didn't wish to side with any bloc. So it started a non-alignment movement. Non-alignment was not like taking a middle path or being neutral. It actually meant not totally being a part of any of the two blocs. So suppose you're neutral, you can't take a stand in a question. You need to take the middle path. But India used to take a stand in the Cold War questions. For example, the Vietnam issue. The post-war era from the 1947, India-Japan relations took a new path. Japan recognized Indian independence very early, established diplomatic relations in 1950. In 1952, India and Japan signed a peace treaty. This peace treaty gave way to India becoming the first recipient of Japan's ODA, the Official Development Assistance, in 1958. It is under this ODA that even today India gets loans from Japan at about 0.1% interest rate. there is a huge history behind how this ODA shaped Indian economy. I'll explain it later in detail. For now, let's get back to the 1950s. On one side, India is out from 200 years of colonial exploitation. And on the other side, Japan, devastated by 2 nuclear bombs. Both nations were in the pursuit of massive reconstruction. India was pretty backward in terms of technology and industrialization since it had no experience of modernization. But Japan was very modern and advanced with respect to technology. Japan is a very resource-deficient country, owing to its geography. It lacked the raw material resources required for its industries, especially for its steel mills. It couldn't ask for raw materials from its immediate neighborhood China and Korea because they would claim war reparation charges. So they went a little more west and asked India. But India's was a closed economy. It didn't allow for foreign trade. India had abundant of iron ores, but no proper machinery to extract and utilize that. Japan had sophisticated technology, and it badly needed steel for its economic development. To produce steel, they needed iron ore. India decided to export iron ores to Japan and help rebuild its economy. It is here Japan offered its first ODA to India with a condition to utilize the ODA money to buy the required machinery to extract iron ores and export it to Japan. The economic assistance was a conditional assistance, much similar to most of the assistance from the Western countries. Japan also gave $681.6 million as economic aid for its second and third 5-year plans. There's a difference between aid and a loan. Loan needs to be repaid, but aid or grant need not be repaid. It's like a charity money. A popular Japanese businessman, Yoshio Yamanouchi, stated there are hardly any people who know that it was India that was behind such a good start. And Japan became an economic powerhouse in just 20 years. And from the 1950 to 73, which is considered the golden age of capitalism, Japan grew at a staggering GDP rate of 9.6%. India too benefited from the deal. It got heavy export orders of raw materials. The raw materials were used by the Japanese to manufacture heavy machinery, which in turn was imported by India to move forth on its developmental path. But from the mid-60s, economic interactions of these two nations began to decline. I had said earlier, Japan was a US ally and was part of the capitalist bloc, while India was non-aligned. Although non-aligned, it tilted towards the Soviet Union. Circumstances forced India to get closer to the Soviet. Its defense needs, economic needs, and strategic needs pushed India towards seeking the Soviet help rather than the American help. India moving towards USSR wasn't liked by Japan at all. This is also the reason why economic interaction declined. It was natural, right? Japan was a key ally of US. With the Cold War on, Japan would stand on the US side, hence kept minimal interaction with India. Despite all the friendship talks and treaties, Japan stood neutral with respect to India's wars with China and Pakistan in 1962 and 65. Right throughout the Cold War, India-Japan relations were cold. And Japanese businesses too were more interested in Southeast Asian nations rather than India. The perception of each other was very different. India viewed Japan as a highly developed modern power, a role model power for developing economies. But Japan looked at India as an underdeveloped power. Not even a power, just an underdeveloped third world country. Especially with the closed nature of Indian economy, not allowing for foreign investments and having very little trade, he had a view of India as a weak country in the geopolitical arena. From 50s to 90s, India and Japan had contrasting growth rates. While India grew at an average of 3%, Japan grew at 8.4%. India largely had a stagnant growth, while Japan witnessed high growth. But from the 90s, it was altogether a different story. In fact, a reversal. India liberalized its economy.
I want to share with you that the world has changed. Beyond recognition, we in this country have to wake up to the harsh new realities of this world. We will ensure that our industrial economy becomes a vibrant industrial economy.
So after liberalization, from 90s, India started to clock high growth rates and Japan started clocking stagnant growth rates. India implemented a series of economic reforms in 1991. India opened up to foreign investments, devalued rupee by 18% to make exports competitive, ended the regressive license raj, privatized the economy and divested all its government assets. While Japan, on the other hand, faced with an economic disaster in the form of an asset bubble crash that triggered what is called a lost decade in Japanese history, where Japan's growth rates fell to 0.4% from 9% years back. The aging population only made things worse for the Japanese. The economic miracle that started post-war ended abruptly, and till today, Japan is yet to recover from it. From the 90s, world history took a new path. Cold War ended. the Soviet Union disintegrated. The world became unipolar now. The world looked up to the capitalist Western bloc as the only successful model. India could no longer move towards the Soviet for its developmental needs. It had to now get closer with the Western countries for investments. But India soon knew the West cannot be the only option. So it looked at the East. When it looked, it was Japan that was a developed power and with whom it had an okayish kind of relation. So India gave lucrative offers for Japanese companies to invest in India. But Japan was still reluctant to invest in India. This time it was not because of Cold War, but because of poor infrastructure. And please, it's not like India never had Japanese investments before 90s. In the 80s itself, Suzuki had a 26% stake in Maruti. But although Japan started to have a positive outlook towards India, with India shedding off its socialist economic nature and embracing a sort of capitalistic tilted mixed economy. But in 1998, India-Japan relations reached a low point. In fact, the lowest point in the history, because India conducted nuclear tests successfully and announced itself to the world as a nuclear power.
Today, at 15:45 hours, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests in the Pokhran range.
Just last week, India conducted a series of nuclear explosive tests. So again, I ask India to halt its nuclear weapons program and join the 149 other nations that have already signed the comprehensive test ban.
Pakistan, China, the United States of America, and several other countries sharply reacted to the Indian nuclear tests.
लेकिन भारत ने इन सभी आलोचनाओं को किनारे करते हुए 13 मई को फिर से पोखरण में 2 और परमाणु परीक्षण किए.
Japan, which is the biggest and only victim of a nuclear attack, was clearly unhappy. The then Japanese ambassador called these tests as a slap on the face of the Japanese people. India was sanctioned by the developed world. Japan froze its yen loans to India. Official dialogues were cancelled. And the Japanese Diet, which is the Japanese parliament, passed a resolution condemning the test. But this was only until 2001. The circumstances itself forced Japan to get closer to India again. So there were major factors that brought India and Japan closer. First, China's rise as a dominant power. Japan was Asia's biggest power since the 50s. It was all Japanese supremacy in Asia. But from the 90s, China, with whom Japan has had a strained relationship throughout the modern history, started to rise as a dominant power. Japan's status as the dominant power was challenged by a rising China. In geopolitics, any country would be concerned at a neighbor's economic rise. And so did Japan. But what was more concerning was China's assertiveness in the region. Its rapid military modernization and arms build-up. Japan felt threatened, and so did India, which has had hostile relationship with China since the independence. The second factor, terrorism. The 9/11 incident shook the entire world. US was threatened by terror outfits such as the Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Those Islamic terror organizations not just threatened US, but also its Western allies, which included Japan. The terror outfits openly warned they'd be offering a reward of 500 grams gold to those killing citizens of US allies like Japan and Italy. Japan clearly understood it was under the radar of the terrorist organizations, so it needed to beef up its security. Talking about terror threats to India, when there's Pakistan as your neighbor, there's no need for further explanation. The third factor, maritime security. You see, as I said earlier, Japan is a resource-deficient country. It gets 99% of its oil through imports and imports 92% of that oil from the Middle East. And tanker ships need to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. This is where lies the threats from pirates and terrorists. A number of times, Japanese tanker ships were attacked, and this brought their energy needs to danger. And India too imports about 40% of its oil from that route. India too faces the same threats. And that is not just on the Arab waters. It's also on the Chinese waters. So here's one incident which made India win the Japanese hearts. So what happened once? A Japanese ship named Alondra Rainbow was on its coast to Africa, and suddenly it got hijacked by a group of pirates in the Indian Ocean. There's an estimate that it was carrying about $100 million worth of goods. Japanese exporters became traumatized at this. But since they had to pass through the Indian waters, they had to come under the eyesight of our Indian Navy. The Indian Coast Guard got suspicious of the hijacked ship and just immediately rushed there. The pirates had totally changed the appearance of the Japanese ship so that no one could find that out. But Indian Navy found that out and immediately rescued it and saved Japan of millions of dollars. This act of the Indian Navy commanded massive respect and gratitude towards India by Japan and was said to be one of the starting reasons for Japan to engage with India as a strategic partner again, forgetting the 98 nuclear tests. The fourth factor is United Nations. Both India and Japan are non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. While their common enemy, China, is a permanent member and has a bigger power in the United Nations Security Council. China has often misused its veto power against India and Japan. And also there has been a deterioration in the way United Nations has been functioning over a long time. India and Japan, along with Brazil and Germany, have formed a group called G4 to vouch for reforms in the UN. So the next factor, the fifth factor, is the population deficit. Japan's witnessing an aging population, and that too a declining population, which is not at all a good sign for their economy, for any economy in fact. While India, on the other side, is relatively having a very young population and growing at a very healthy rate. A large population of India being at the working age, Japan sees as an opportunity in investing in India and offering lucrative job opportunities, again with the skilled labor coming at a low cost compared to many other nations. So all these factors, China's assertive rise, terrorism, maritime security, UN reforms, and the population deficit is what brought India and Japan together once again. And also not just that, Japan's perception towards India had a complete changeover. It no longer saw India as a weak and a hopeless power, but as a strong, rising power with huge potential. Japan saw India as a power that could balance China in the Indo-Pacific. Since both countries being democracies, interests converged, and 2000s ushered in a new era of Indo-Japanese friendship. India and Japan started working in partnership in a number of sectors. Let's see how they've collaborated well enough for their mutual benefit. So first is the ODA, the Official Development Assistance. As I said earlier, I wanted to explain it in detail. Now I'm explaining it. Japan's ODA is a program which provides technical and financial support to developing countries. Japan provides loans, grants, and technical assistance. The loans are given in yen. There are only two reasons why Japan provides ODA. One, to ensure security, peace, and prosperity in the world. A very noble intention, right? Second is to maintain friendly relations with the developing countries. Secure natural resources from them for their own growth. Selfish, but still harmless. Japan is supporting India's development through its ODA. Provides grants, free charity money to India, provides loans to developmental projects at just about 0.1%. Japan is providing loan and aid for economic infrastructure projects, transportation projects, metro rail projects in Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Delhi, Kolkata, Chennai and Bangalore. The Mumbai-Ahmedabad high-speed rail project, Western dedicated freight corridor, industrial corridors in Chennai, Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, the bullet train projects, and in energy, power supply project in Andaman, a number of hydropower projects and solar power projects. Japan also provides loans for sanitation projects in Bangalore, Odisha and Madhya Pradesh. For rural, drinking water project in Rajasthan, irrigation project in Andhra, and environmental projects such as cleaning the Ganga river, forestry management project in Tamil Nadu, Nagaland and Odisha, medical projects, a project for diarrheal prevention in Kolkata. Japan is also the fifth largest investor in India. The huge workforce, the low-cost skilled labor, and a huge market make India the most favorable investment destination for Japan. And also another reason is the infrastructure, which is far better than it was years ago. Look how the time has changed. From least favorable destination to the most favorable destination. If you looked at Japan's projects, it's more towards development and which has a significant social impact. And also, India is the largest receiver of Japanese ODA. Second is the maritime cooperation. They cooperate in maritime through Coast Guard exercises. In a Coast Guard exercise, countries involved learn the best techniques of rescue operations of any distressed ships. India has ratified the RECAP. It's the Cooperative Agreement for Anti-Piracy. The member countries share intelligence about any suspected piracy operations. So this has helped the respective countries to curb the piracy operations against their vessels. The third, as I said earlier, is their cooperation in many multilateral platforms. For example, the Quad, a group consisting of India, Japan, US and Australia. A group that is actually formed to keep a check on Chinese activities in the Indo-Pacific. India and Japan, along with Australia, have created a Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, SCRI, to move away from the Chinese dependency in trade. Japan terms India a strategic global partner, a term which is used by Japan with none other than except US. And the thing, India and Japan having regular bilateral annual summits, which is a 2+2 dialogues, where the foreign ministers and the defense ministers meet with each other, shows the extent of the growing India-Japan relations. India-Japan relations is at one of the best times in the history. reminds of the ancient timeline. The only few irritants in the India-Japan relationship is India's closeness with Russia, which can never be foregone by India. Japan is also unhappy with India's presence in the BRICS grouping. This is something that can never be worked out between the two. And India's trade deficit with Japan is a big concern for India. And it's not a concern for Japan. India imports way too much than it exports from Japan. Apart from these few irritants, India and Japan relations is in the best of times right now, as I said earlier. And credits need to be given for the deceased Japanese PM Shinzo Abe for prioritizing India in their foreign policy and bringing Japan closer to India. Our own Prime Ministers, Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi, have only taken it to a different level altogether. There are 2 articles that I intend to share in the description for you to take some time to understand India-Japan ties even more in depth. So, coming to the end of the video, the lessons we get from our ties with Japan. 1. You can take the best aspects of another country for your own betterment. That is what Japan did with spiritualism from India. And that is what India did with nationalism from Japan. 2. Only your economic rise will yield you respect in the geopolitical arena. It was only after India started growing economically from the 90s that India started getting global recognition and respect, and consequently, Japan started engaging with India. 3. Befriend the enemy of your enemy. So together you can ward off the threat from that common enemy. That is what India and Japan are doing with respect to China. 4. You need to tell that in the comment section. This is all with the episode 2 of our Geopolitics Friends of India series. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and see you in the 3rd episode where we cover the India-Israel ties. Thank you.